You've probably heard this is a book about faith. It's not. It's a book about whether you'd let your father die if you knew no one would ever find out. Here's the thing. A few months ago, Stephen Bartlett sat down 3 men, an atheist, a Christian, and a psychiatrist, and asked them one question. Why do 9 in 10 young people in the UK feel like their life has no purpose? They talked for 3 hours. They brought up suffering, free will, God, psychedelics, cancer in children, and not one of them realized they were basically restaging a conversation Dostoevsky wrote in 1880, word for word, almost. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote this after his 3-year-old son died of epilepsy, the same disease he had himself. The favorite brother in the book is also named Alyosha. That is not a coincidence. That's a man writing through grief in real time. By the end of this, you're going to have to pick a side. Purpose or freedom, suffering with meaning or suffering with none, and I don't think you're going to like which one you actually land on. It really is staggering, when you step back, that a single 19th century Russian novel basically maps out the exact contours of the modern meaning crisis. So, let's dig into it properly. At the center of all this is Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. But we're going to look at it through a very specific modern lens, tying it back to that Diary of a CEO episode, where an atheist philosopher, a Christian apologist, and a psychiatrist debate why everyone feels so lost right now. We're also pulling in some Sigmund Freud, his 1928 essay, Dostoevsky and Parricide, which is highly controversial but psychoanalyzes the author's own unresolved trauma. And to ground all of it, the historical record on Russia's 1864 judicial reforms. So the mission here is to figure out how a story from 1880 acts as a perfect mirror for the existential dread you get from scrolling through your phone, and why the question of who killed the father isn't just a murder mystery, it's a deeply unsettling question about your own psychological and moral survival. To get to the bottom of that, start with the family. Because Dostoevsky doesn't hand us normal characters. He gives us walking, breathing philosophical worldviews. Strip away the reputation for a second. Here's the plot. There's a father, Fyodor Karamazov, and pretty much everyone around him has a reason to want him dead. He's a drunk. He's cruel. He's fighting his own son over money and over a woman. 3 sons, sometimes counted as 4. Dmitri, the oldest, all impulse and passion, a soldier who can't control himself. Ivan, the middle one, the intellectual, cold, brilliant, and quietly furious at God. Alyosha, the youngest, gentle, training to be a monk, the moral center of the whole book. And then there's Smerdyakov, the servant, the one nobody counts as a brother, even though there's a very strong implication that he is one. That family structure is the crucible of the entire book, because Fyodor, the father, is a pure sensualist. He only cares about his own pleasure. He completely abandoned these boys, left them to be raised by distant relatives. Profound neglect, and because of that, the brothers are deeply alienated, from him, from each other, and honestly, from themselves, a recipe for disaster. So when they all end up back in their hometown as adults, the tension is off the charts. A house built on decades of unspoken resentment. The father turns up dead. Dmitri looks guilty. Dmitri gets arrested. Dmitri gets tried. Now, here's what most summaries do. They tell you it's a murder mystery wrapped around a philosophy lecture. That's lazy. It's not a whodunit. Dostoevsky tells you pretty early who's actually responsible. What he's asking is a completely different question. If everyone in a family wanted this man dead, who actually holds the guilt? The one who did it with his hands, or the ones who wanted it in their hearts? Which is a wild shift in how we usually think about crime, because in a normal legal sense, guilt is binary. You either swung the weapon, or you didn't. You're in the room or you're out. But in Dostoevsky's spiritual framework, a thought carries the exact same weight as an action. Let's push back on that for a second, because it sounds completely unworkable in the real world. Say you have a terrible boss, and in a moment of extreme frustration, you secretly think, I wish he'd get hit by a bus. And he actually does get hit by a bus. Do you share the guilt? How does a society judge what's only in your heart? You can't put a thought on trial. Well, you can't legally put a thought on trial, which is exactly why Dostoevsky moves the trial out of the courtroom and into the human soul. He's exploring the mechanism of causality. If you harbor a profound desire for someone's death, your microactions, your words, your resentments, even your passive silence, all of it starts creating an environment where that death becomes possible. The stage gets set. The novel forces us to realize every single brother, well, except maybe Alyosha, shares complicity. They all stood to benefit. Ivan provides the intellectual justification for murder. Dmitri provides the chaotic physical threat that acts as a smokescreen. The guy who physically does it is just the final domino falling in a long chain reaction of toxic desires. It changes the entire definition of innocence, doesn't it? You can't keep your hands in your pockets and say, I didn't physically do this, so my conscience is clean. The rot started long before the crime. That's the core worldview here. Radical interconnectedness. Dostoevsky thought the idea of the autonomous, isolated individual was a total illusion. We are all responsible for everyone. This is where it gets interesting, because this book started as true crime. Years before he wrote it, Dostoevsky was in a Siberian prison camp. He met a convict named Ilinsky, sentenced for killing his own father. Years later, it turned out someone else had actually done it. Ilinsky was innocent the entire time. He'd just been the obvious suspect, the one who looked guilty. Dostoevsky actually documented this man in an earlier book. Ilinsky was a man of intense passion, basically the exact blueprint for Dmitri. Notoriously terrible relationship with his father over an inheritance. He looked exactly like a murderer should look. He acted like one. He didn't do it. The system convicted him anyway, because the system looked at the narrative, the motive, the bad behavior, and convicted the narrative, not the facts. That's the actual engine of this novel, not who did it. It's what happens when a justice system and a family convict the person who seems most guilty instead of the person who actually is. Dmitri gets tried, and the trial takes up nearly 100 pages, and it is absolutely brutal, because you watch lawyers build an airtight, completely convincing case against a man who didn't do it. If you've ever watched a true crime documentary and screamed at the screen because the evidence looked so clean and so wrong, you already understand the engine of this book. Dostoevsky wrote that feeling in 1880. And to grasp why Dostoevsky was so anxious about this, look at Russia's 1864 judicial reforms. Crucial context. Before 1864, Russia used a closed, inquisitorial legal system, not secret police dragging people away in the night. Nothing that dramatic. It was entirely reliant on written documents and bureaucrats. Everything happened behind closed doors. Judges just read files. No public trials, no juries, no defense attorneys putting on a show, a paper-pushing machine, a cold, administrative one. Then in 1864, Tsar Alexander II brings in Western-style reforms. Suddenly you have public jury trials, cross-examinations, adversarial lawyers arguing cases in front of crowds. On paper, that sounds like massive progress. We literally consider that the foundation of a free society. You get a lawyer, you get a jury. But Dostoevsky hated it. Why? Because he was deeply suspicious of Western rationalism. He didn't see these new courts as finding the truth. He saw them as theaters of manipulation, turning morality into a game of rhetoric. It became about who was the better storyteller. The objective truth stopped mattering. What mattered was which lawyer could spin the most compelling psychological story for the jury, which is so relevant to how we operate today. Think about how often, on social media or in the court of public opinion, we mistake a convincing narrative for the objective truth. Someone goes viral for a bad interaction, their past behavior looks problematic, they look guilty, so we convict them in our minds instantly. Dmitri looks incredibly guilty. He was running around town waving a brass pestle, threatening his father. The narrative is flawless. He is fundamentally innocent of the murder. That's the terrifying danger of relying purely on a logical conclusion. The prosecutor builds a psychological profile of Dmitri so airtight, so perfectly reasoned, it becomes an intellectual trap. Even his friends start to doubt him. Even the people who love him hear this logic and think, well, maybe he did do it. Dostoevsky is warning us that human psychology is too messy and contradictory to ever be perfectly mapped out by logic. Most videos rush through the next chapter. Don't. This is the one philosophy departments teach completely on its own, disconnected from the rest of the novel because it's that dense. Ivan tells his younger brother a story. Christ comes back to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition and performs miracles, and the crowd recognizes him instantly. Then the church has him arrested. An old cardinal visits him in his cell overnight and basically tells him, we don't need you anymore. You gave humanity freedom, and freedom is a burden. Nobody actually wants it. People want bread, and they want someone to tell them what to do. We've built a system that gives them exactly that. So please, stay quiet and stay out of our way. The Grand Inquisitor chapter is honestly, arguably the most devastating critique of human nature ever written. The Inquisitor's thesis is brutally simple. Christ fundamentally overestimated humanity. Christ came offering spiritual freedom, the freedom to actively choose good over evil, to wrestle with your own conscience. But the Inquisitor says freedom is terrifying because it's too much responsibility. It requires constantly facing the anxiety of choice, staring into the abyss of your own mortality without a rulebook guaranteeing you're safe. Humans don't want that burden. They want submission. Just tell me what to do and feed me. They want to be told what to believe and who to hate, as long as their bellies are full. The church, he claims, fixed Christ's mistake by replacing agonizing freedom with miracle, mystery, and authority. Hold that thought, because that's basically the same argument Alex O'Connor made on that Diary of a CEO episode, just in secular clothing. He argued that religion isn't really about truth at all. It's what he called a death-denying pursuit, an immortality project, something people build because facing their own mortality directly is unbearable. John is making the exact same accusation 3 religions deep in 1880. People don't want God, they want comfort, and the church figured out how to sell them comfort dressed up as God. The parallel to that modern podcast is striking. O'Connor brings up the psychologist Ernest Becker, who coined the term immortality project, the idea that we're the only animals who know we're going to die, and that knowledge is paralyzing if you stare at it directly. So Becker says we invent grand narratives, religions, legacy projects, empires, or even just chasing a promotion at work. Anything to feel like we matter, something that promises to outlast our physical bodies. The Grand Inquisitor is saying the exact same thing. You offered them spiritual truth that requires bearing existential pain. We offer them an illusion that makes the pain go away, and you don't need a 16th century Spanish cardinal to see this happening today. Look at the phone in your hand. Look at your feed. The algorithm is feeding you exactly what you want to hear, telling you what to think, tucking you into a cozy little echo chamber. So is tech our modern Grand Inquisitor. Are we happily trading our freedom for digital bread? That is the perfect modern translation of this chapter. The Inquisitor literally says, in the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, make us your slaves, but feed us. What is the modern algorithm doing? If not exactly that, it's designed to eliminate the friction of choice. It curates reality. It tells you what to buy, what political outrage to feel. It keeps you constantly distracted from the existential void. Dr. K, the psychiatrist on that podcast, talks about this too. He notes that when people face what he calls passive challenges, things happening to them that they can't control, they get overwhelmed and lose their sense of purpose. So the algorithm swoops in to manage that overwhelm. It offers a curated world, but the cost is your autonomy. It's the ultimate trade-off, and it's so comfortable we barely notice it happening. But to really understand why Ivan tells the story of the Inquisitor in the first place, we have to back up, because right before he launches into it, he lays the philosophical groundwork for his own despair. Before the Grand Inquisitor story, Ivan does something that's honestly harder to sit through. He tells Alyosha about children, real cases he'd read about. A child beaten, a child hunted by dogs for sport, in front of their own mother. And Ivan says, look, even if there's a God, even if everything gets explained and forgiven and made whole again at the end of time, I don't accept the ticket. I'm not signing up for a universe where a child has to suffer like that so some grand harmony can exist later. He calls it returning the ticket, not denying God exists, refusing to accept the terms. In theological terms, what Ivan is doing is presenting an anti-theodicy. A theodicy is a philosophical attempt to justify God's actions in a world full of evil. An attempt to explain why a good God allows bad things to happen, the classic problem of evil. But Ivan completely rejects the premise. He isn't arguing that God doesn't exist. He's arguing that if God does exist and this world is his design, then his methods are fundamentally immoral. Because of the children, they are the ultimate innocents. They haven't committed any sins. So if their suffering is the mandatory price of admission for eternal harmony, Ivan simply says, the price is too high. Here's the easiest way to understand Ivan's stance. Imagine you're invited to a beautiful, perfect, utopian city. Zero crime, perfect weather, endless joy. Sounds great. But then you find out the power source for the whole city is one innocent child locked in a basement suffering endlessly. He isn't saying the city doesn't exist. He's standing at the gates, looking at that ticket of admission and saying, keep your utopia, I refuse to live here. This exact debate broke out on that Diary of a CEO episode. Alex O'Connor presses the Christian guest on this exact vulnerability. If a loving God exists, why is there pediatric cancer? Did a 1-year-old get cancer because someone ate an apple millions of years ago? The modern atheist philosopher is wielding the exact same weapon Ivan Karamazov forged back in 1880. And it's so potent because Ivan isn't just being cynical. His rebellion comes from a profound sense of justice and compassion. He loves humanity too much to accept a divine plan built on torture. But this is where the intellectual theory slams straight into a brick wall of reality. Ivan's rebellion has a fatal flaw. If you tear down that divine moral order because it feels unjust, what takes its place? Ivan's own logical conclusion is this famous line, if there is no God and no immortality, then everything is lawful. That single sentence, everything is lawful, is the pivot point for the entire tragedy. Because Ivan is an intellectual, he sits in taverns, drinks tea, and debates high-level philosophy. It's all just a thought experiment for him. He doesn't actually want to go out and commit crimes. But ideas don't stay in taverns. They leak out into the real world. Think about the last time you vented a toxic, highly cynical opinion online just to score a debate point. We usually think of our thoughts as harmless abstractions. But Dostoevsky is asking a terrifying question. If someone else reads your thought, takes it literally, and acts on it, where does your guilt end and theirs begin? Because in the Karamazov house, the person who absorbs Ivan's philosophy is Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is basically the dark, distorted mirror of the whole family. As mentioned earlier, it's heavily implied he's the illegitimate son of Fyodor, born to a marginalized woman and raised as a servant in his own father's house, which is messed up on so many levels. He's deeply resentful, he tortures animals, he suffers from epilepsy, and while Ivan treats everything as lawful, as a theoretical game, Smerdyakov is a literalist. He takes it to heart. He idolizes Ivan's intellect. So when Ivan casually asserts that everything is lawful, Smerdyakov doesn't hear a debate. He hears an instruction manual. He hears, "I have permission." And so Smerdyakov actually goes through with it. He physically murders the father. The truly chilling part is that he does it believing Ivan gave him a silent moral sanction. The psychological realism here is astounding. Before the murder, Ivan has a strange coded conversation with Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov subtly suggests Ivan should leave town for a few days, basically saying, "Get out of the way so I can do this." By leaving, Ivan removes any protective barrier around the father. Ivan feels deeply uneasy about it. He leaves anyway, and Smerdyakov interprets that as a green light. Later, when the truth comes out and Smerdyakov confesses to Ivan, he refuses to take sole responsibility. He tells Ivan point blank, "You went away. You, as good as, said to me, 'You can murder my parent. I won't hinder you.'" He throws it right back in Ivan's face. He insists Ivan is the true mastermind, the moral author of the crime. And this realization utterly shatters Ivan. His mind literally fractures under the weight of it. It's what happens when your internal compass is destroyed. Ivan thought he was a pure rationalist standing above the messy emotions of the world, until he sees the bloody reality of his own ideas. When he sees that his ideas caused a real death, he collapses. He begins to hallucinate, and he hallucinates the devil sitting on his sofa, mocking him. This hallucination is such a brilliant psychological device because the devil doesn't appear as some majestic, terrifying demon with horns. He's not a grand monster. He appears as a middle-aged, slightly shabby Russian gentleman, a cosmic parasite wearing a bad suit, and what the devil does is devastating. He feeds Ivan's own high-minded ideas back to him, but in a cheap, vulgar way, stripping away all the intellectual glamour. The devil mocks Ivan's belief that a new man can simply invent his own morality. "That's charming," the devil says, "but if you want to swindle, why do you need a moral sanction for doing it?" That's our modern Russian all over. He can't bring himself to swindle without a moral sanction. That's such a gut punch. The devil is basically telling him, "You aren't a grand philosopher. You just wanted your father dead, and you invented a whole philosophical system to justify your own dark desire." Ivan's grand philosophy is exposed as an elaborate rationalization for a base desire, and that cognitive dissonance destroys him. He descends into brain fever. And what happens to Smerdyakov? He realizes Ivan is cracking and rejecting him. He can't bear the weight of his own existence without Ivan's intellectual validation. So he hangs himself, leaving the innocent brother Dmitri to take the fall. The only man who could prove his innocence is dead. So how does an author even come up with a philosophy that maps out the psychological justification for killing a father? To answer that, look at Dostoevsky's own mind. This is where Sigmund Freud actually steps in. He examines Dostoevsky's psychology in his 1928 essay, Dostoevsky and Parricide. Freud's essay is a landmark piece of literary psychoanalysis. He points out a stunning pattern. He argues that three of the greatest works of Western literature, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, all revolve around the exact same central crime, parricide, killing the father. Freud argues this cannot possibly be a coincidence. He posits that the desire to kill the father is the universal shadow of the human psyche, the very core of what he calls the Oedipus complex, the ultimate taboo, and therefore the ultimate source of unconscious guilt in the human mind. And it gets incredibly personal for Dostoevsky. The historical record shows he himself suffered from severe epilepsy. And who does he give epilepsy to in the novel? Smerdyakov, the actual murderer. It's as if he's taking his own physical disease, his own perceived flaw, and projecting it onto the darkest character in the book. And even more tragic, Dostoevsky's own son, also named Alyosha, died of epilepsy at age 3. While he was writing this very novel. The layering of trauma there is profound. Freud uses this to dig even deeper into Dostoevsky's compulsions. Beyond the epilepsy, Freud focuses heavily on Dostoevsky's severe gambling addiction. He was notoriously terrible with money, but Freud didn't view the gambling as a simple financial vice. He viewed it as a deeply psychological, defiant struggle with fate. And in Freudian terms, fate is often a psychological stand-in for the father figure. So how does gambling connect to the father, and how does it relieve guilt? It sounds counterintuitive, self-sabotage as a way to feel better, but Freud points to a crucial detail observed by Dostoevsky's own wife. Dostoevsky wasn't playing to win. Unconsciously, he was playing to lose, to punish himself. The mechanism works like this. If you carry a massive unconscious guilt, like the taboo desire for your own tyrannical father to die, your psyche demands punishment to balance the scales. The roulette table is the punishment. When he lost every single ruble, when he plunged his family into crushing poverty and had to beg friends for loans, he was actively engineering his own punishment. Once the punishment was achieved, the unconscious guilt was temporarily paid off, the pressure valve released. His wife actually noted that his writing never went better than when he had lost absolutely everything. Only when his sense of guilt was satisfied by the self-inflicted misery were his creative inhibitions lifted. It's as if Dostoevsky split his own fractured psyche into these brothers, his passion and recklessness into Dmitri, his intellectual doubt into Ivan, his spiritual longing for purity into Alyosha, and his literal physical illness and darkest shame into Smerdyakov. He put his own soul on trial, which brings us right back to the actual trial in the book, because Dmitri's trial is a massive media circus. The whole nation is watching, and to understand the environment of this trial, loop back to those 1864 judicial reforms, the adversarial courts. According to the historical record, these new trials basically became a form of national entertainment, kind of like a carnival, people packing the galleries for the drama, not to see truth served, but to witness melodrama, emotional breakdowns, and the rhetorical acrobatics of celebrity lawyers. The defense lawyer for Dmitri is a man named Fetyukovich. He represents everything Dostoevsky despised about this new system. He tries to get what they called a compassionate acquittal. He doesn't just stick to arguing that Dmitri didn't physically do it. He argues that even if Dmitri did it, we shouldn't really blame him because of his environment, leaning on a Russian legal term, affect, which basically means a state of temporary insanity or uncontrollable passion. The environmental determinism defense. Fetyukovich argues Dmitri is just a victim of his father's neglect in a cruel society, therefore his actions were predetermined, and he isn't truly responsible. Dostoevsky based this lawyer on real people. The historical record shows Dostoevsky based Fetyukovich on famous Russian defense attorneys of the time, specifically a man named Spasovich, who pioneered these exact tactics in real, highly publicized trials. And this is where Dostoevsky saw real-world consequences that genuinely terrified him. There was a specific case, the Kronenberg case. A father was put on trial for brutally beating his 7-year-old daughter. The defense lawyer, Spasovich, managed to get the father acquitted by eloquently arguing about the father's psychological state, the stress he was under, basically making the abuser the victim, downplaying the objective reality of the child's suffering by turning it into a debate about the father's internal state. Dostoevsky covered this in his own journalism and was absolutely horrified. He felt these lawyers were, in his words, adulterers of thought, who weaponized psychology to erase personal moral responsibility. Fair point to push back on here, though. Empathy and psychology matter. If someone grows up horribly abused, shouldn't a justice system take that trauma into account? Why was Dostoevsky so terrified of empathy in the courtroom? Because he believed that if you take away a person's guilt by blaming their environment, you also take away their human dignity. If we are just products of our environment, reacting mechanically to stimuli, then we aren't free. And if we aren't free, we can't be saved. He wrote in his own diary, something close to, if everything is an effect, then a glance at the moon at night is an effect. Effect is an awful word. A slippery slope. If you can blame everything on psychology or environment, the concept of right and wrong dissolves entirely. Nobody is ever guilty of anything. But here's the massive, paradoxical twist of the trial in the novel. The jury is made up of local peasants. The lawyer, Fetyukovich, spins this beautiful, modern, psychologically nuanced defense. A total masterpiece of rhetoric, and the peasant jury rejects it completely. They stand up for traditional absolute morality. No, murder is a crime, and we won't excuse it with fancy words about environment. They hold the line on moral responsibility. But here's Dostoevsky's devastating irony. In their righteous effort to uphold objective morality, they convict the wrong man, because Dmitri is actually innocent of the physical act. It perfectly proves Dostoevsky's terrifying point. Human institutions, no matter how reformed, how logical, or how well-intentioned, are fundamentally incapable of perfectly administering divine justice. The legal system tries to use logic to capture truth, and it fails. It convicts an innocent man because it cannot see the spiritual reality of Smerdyakov's guilt or Ivan's complicity. Which brings us back to the core tension of this whole video. If human justice fails, if intellectual rationality leads to nihilism like Ivan's, and if the freedom of choice is an unbearable burden, like the Grand Inquisitor claims, then how are we supposed to live? That's the exact meaning Crisis discussed on that Diary of a CEO podcast. Dr. K points out that young people today are flooded with varying worldviews through their phones, constantly told what to think by algorithms, yet fundamentally disconnected from any internal sense of direction. Alex O'Connor uses a phrase quoting Pascal in that same conversation: "We have the money without the game. We have physical comfort, we have tech, but we lack the struggle that gives life shape." So we started this video with the question of why 9 in 10 young people feel aimless. Does Dostoevsky actually give us an answer to this crisis, or does he just leave us in the dark with Ivan's despair? He does provide an answer, and it's embodied entirely by the youngest brother, Alyosha, the one training to be a monk. But what's vital to understand is the mechanism of Alyosha's response. He does not defeat Ivan's intellectual arguments with better intellectual arguments. He doesn't try to out-logic the Grand Inquisitor. Dostoevsky fundamentally believed you cannot debate your way out of nihilism. The solution to the crisis of meaning is intensely practical and lived, not theoretical. Right at the very end of the book, after all this trauma, the murder, the trial, Ivan's madness, there's the tragic death of a young boy named Ilyusha, and Alyosha gathers the boy's young friends around a stone. He doesn't give them a grand theological lecture about why God allowed their friend to die. He doesn't try to build a theodicy to justify the suffering. What does he tell them? He tells them to simply remember the love they shared for this boy. Alyosha says, "Let us never forget how good we once felt here, all together, united by such a good and kind feeling." Dostoevsky's ultimate argument is that meaning is not a puzzle you solve with your brain, it's an action. Meaning is found through the willing acceptance of shared suffering and the preservation of active love. When you take responsibility for the pain of others, when you refuse to look away and bind yourself to them through love, intellectual despair loses its grip. And in that podcast, Dr. K talks about how engaging in active challenges, choosing to do difficult things, engaging physically and emotionally with the real world rather than passively consuming it, restores a neurological sense of purpose. Alyosha's act of love is the ultimate active challenge. You cannot logic your way into purpose. You find it by accepting responsibility for each other, which is the exact opposite of Ivan's cold isolation, and the Grand Inquisitor's desire to manage and control everyone. It's the triumph of the living experience of connection over the sterile isolation of extreme rationality. Before we wrap up, consider this. The philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin studied this exact novel and figured out why it still feels so intensely alive today. He called it unfinalizability. In Dostoevsky's world, a human soul fundamentally refuses to be wholly defined by any external source. Not by society, not by a psychological profile, not by an algorithm, and not even by death. Dmitri, Ivan, Alyosha, they all actively resist being put in a box. So if you feel like you're suffering from a lack of purpose today, maybe it's because you're letting the modern world finalize you. You're letting data points and social expectations tell you who you are. Dostoevsky's challenge to you is to refuse the final period at the end of your sentence. You are too broad to be summed up, and your story is entirely up to you.